So this evening we are doing our talk on Hardy and war writing, and I want to welcome you to this, which is one of the wider series of our online talks as part of Hardy's Wessex, The Landscapes That Inspired a Writer, which is a Wessex Museum's multi-museum exhibition across Dorset Museum, Poole Museum, the Salisbury Museum and Wiltshire Museum. And it will be running until the 30th of October this year if you haven't seen it already. So please do check our website to find details of the exhibition and also other workshops, talks, film screenings and storytelling sessions that will be happening over the next few months. Just to give you all a bit of background on Wessex Museums, Wessex Museums is a thriving partnership of museums across Dorset and Wiltshire, and our purpose is to build resilience and relevance of the museums in our partnership and across our region. Our mission is to support museums to connect, inspire and add value to people's lives. And I am the Hardy's exhibition curator, and so have been working closely with them over the last few years to create this exhibition and this series of events. So having given you a bit of background on the wider programme, I'd like to hand over to the talk and just say if anyone has any questions throughout the talk, if you could put them in the Q&A chat, we will return to these at the end of the talk when I can then filter them through to the speakers. But I will now pass over to our chair, Kate Adie, who can kick off tonight's session and introduce our wonderful panel.
Thank you, Harriet, and good evening to everybody. Thank you for joining us. Tonight's subject, well, war. War changes lives, and not surprisingly, writers are inspired or they deem it necessary to put pen to paper, or these days get to grips with a keyboard. Much poetry has resulted from such a stimulus. Descriptions, reflections, protests, glorification. There are no rules. Though with war, there may be thoughts about what the readers might be expecting. Thomas Hardy, as you know, is our subject this evening, a long-lived man who lived through almost 20 wars in his lifetime, culminating in what was called then the Great War, to us World War I. Hardy wrote much about conflicts, and to talk about this, we have two experts with us this evening. Phillip Mallett is Honorary Senior Lecturer in English at the University of St Andrews and a Vice President of the Thomas Hardy Society. His published work includes Rudyard Kipling, A Literary Life, a number of he edited 7 collections of essays, most recently Thomas Hardy in Context and the Victorian Novel and Masculinity, as well as scholarly editions of The Return of the Native, The Mayor of Casterbridge, and Under the Greenwood Tree. His edition of Flora Thompson's Lark Rise to Candleford was published in September 2021. Tai-Chun is Assistant Professor in the Department of Foreign Languages and Literatures at National Chung Hsing University, Taiwan. His book, The Crimean War in Victorian Poetry, explores the predicaments and achievements of mid-Victorian war poets. His article, Writing Catchpenny Verse at Times of Military Crisis in the 19th Century, is forthcoming from Victorian Periodicals Review. He's recently completed an article on Hardy's Boer War poetry and is currently writing an article, The Crimean War, for Oxford Bibliographies in Victorian Literature. Well, there are two people who really know about Hardy and conflict. So may I start first with Philip and ask, what drew you to the poetry of war?
It's the conjunction of two things. First, like many of the people tuning in this evening, I suspect I first came to Hardy through the novels, but increasingly what matters to me has been the poetry. I won't argue he's the greatest English poet. I would just say he's the one who matters most to me. So that's one half of it. The other half is the Boer War itself. You skip past that in my school days, and yet it's an event quite extraordinary as something that looks back as a war to the Napoleonic Wars and looks on to the Great War that was soon to follow. It was divisive. It was divisive not just in the sense there were some people who thought we shouldn't go to war. It was divisive in the sense there were some people, including Emma Hardy, who thought that we were on the wrong side. The Boers, she said, fight for homes and liberty. We fight for the Transvaal funds, gold and diamonds. So that was a radical objection to the war. It's true that it had mass support at the outset, but that support began to diminish as the war went on and on and on. It was also a different kind of war from the ones that the British had fought in the previous half century. Most of those had been against non-white peoples with inferior weaponry and a different faith. Now the British were fighting an enemy that was white, was Christian, and had better guns than they had. It was also, and this was the thing that I completely missed in my school days, on a massive scale. Wellington had about 70,000 troops under his command at Waterloo. The combined forces of the British, the French and the Turks at the Battle of the Alma in the Crimea, again, about 70,000. But by the second year of the war, the British had 500,000 people in the field. And they came from Canada, from New Zealand, from Australia, and from India. So it was, in a sense, a world war. Not that it spread across the world in terms of the battle sites, but in the sense that it engaged such a vast portion of the world. And of course, European powers, and notably the Germans, were looking on with great intentness. So it's the conjunction of these two things, a great poet and a divisive and difficult and under-recalled war. So put those two together, and there's my interest.
Tai-Chun, what drew you to the poetry of war?
Well, war poetry is often considered to be a genre that emerges during the First World War. And when the term war poet is mentioned, most people think of the soldier poets such as Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon. I find the poetry of the First World War deeply moving, but perhaps it has to do with my cultural and educational background. I was raised and born in Taiwan, and when I started writing my PhD on the poetry of the Crimean War at the University of York, I was actually fascinated by 19th century civilians. So that the kind of war poetry that has fascinated me and inspired my research was actually written by those who had no combat experience and then composed war poetry from home. And I think in a sense, their work to me was more cultural relevant in the sense that they had no personal experience of war, just like the 21st century global readers. And they had to struggle with ways of writing about war. So poets like Sir Walter Scott, Alfred Tennyson, Rudyard Kipling, and most recently Thomas Hardy. Their poetry, I would say, raised the fundamental question of how a civilian reading news of war responded to that conflict through poetry.
It's a fascinating subject, but the specific thing I suppose we're looking at this evening is, so many writers have had war as a theme. What is special and distinctive about Hardy in this subject?
Shall I answer first? Yeah.
Yes, please.
I suppose the thing that's most striking about Hardy's attitude to war is that for him, the war really meant the Napoleonic Wars. He spent the whole of the first decade of the 20th century writing The Dynasts, which is about the Napoleonic Wars. When T.E. Lawrence spoke to him in the 1920s, he realized that when Hardy spoke about war, he either meant the Homeric Wars or he meant the Napoleonic Wars. So this is Hardy trying to bring himself into closer contact with a contemporary war. He knew a number of the participants. Reevers Buller, who was the initial commander-in-chief, was a family friend. They had a picture of Buller on their coffee table, waiting for him to sign when he returned. Colonel Long, who was largely responsible for the British defeat at Colenso and the loss of lives, the loss of guns, the loss of the battle, and the loss of confidence in Buller, was another person that they knew well. Arthur Henniker, the husband of Florence Henniker, with whom Hardy had been hopelessly and foolishly in love, was out there with the Coldstream Guards. The newspapers were reporting events within 3 or 4 days of them happening. So he was, in one sense, very, very close to this. But he's also a man approaching 60. In another sense, he was completely alien from it. And he recognized that he didn't share the jingoistic mood, the imperialist mood that was prevalent in the press, prevalent among the thousands of people who gathered together to celebrate the relief of Mafeking and so on. So he found himself in his habitual position, as he put it, one shaped awry, someone who didn't fit, trying to both acknowledge the extent to which he didn't fit with his society and act as a public speaker, someone addressing that society. So it's a curious and ambivalent position. He's both speaking as a patriotic Englishman. His First World War poems were called poems of war and patriotism. But in the South African War poems, many people at least would have doubted whether he was properly a patriot. He didn't think the right things, and yet nonetheless he felt committed to write about this event.
So he's conflicted. So does that affect the quality of the poetry?
It adversely affects, I think, some of the First World War poetry. The line he wrote in the first poem he wrote about the First War, Men Who March Away, was "Victory crowns the just." And Charles Sibley, one of the war poets, said it was simply the worst line ever written. But one of the things I suppose one would have to say, and it's part of what Tai-Chun has written about so well, is that you're writing from the home front. And most of what Hardy has to say, despite the fact he says he loves to write about war, he doesn't write about war. He writes about those left behind by war, or those who have died in the war, or those who might be forgotten by the war. But not a single shot is fired in the course of the poems. There's no narrative. Lots of narratives of Napoleonic Wars. He happily wrote ballad-like poems about those. But when it came to contemporary wars, I suppose he just recognized that his subject matter was still going to be in Wessex. And so one of the things he does is he draws a contemporary event, a real life contemporary event, back into his own familiar imaginative world. And we perhaps have a chance to say more about this in a moment. But when he published the poem Drummer Hodge, it came originally with a headnote that said one of those killed was the native of a village near Casterbridge. Now, Casterbridge is a place that exists in Hardy's fiction. If there were a drummer, and I doubt if there really was one, if there were, he might have been the native of a village near Dorchester. So when Hardy recruits him for his own imagination and gives him the country bumpkin name of Hodge, a name that Hardy in many ways resisted, of course, what he's really doing is conscripting Hodge into his imaginative world almost as ruthlessly as the army conscripted him into the battlefield. So that seems to be genuinely a conflicted position. I'm sure Tai-Chun will have more to say on that.
Yes, they're asking Tai-Chun the same question, really. What's special and distinctive to you with Hardy on this subject?
So when I was attracted, to research Hardy's war poetry, because there has been he has a reputation for influencing the First World War poetry. And I have to confess that I haven't really looked at his First World War poetry, but I kind of focus on the 11 Boer War poems he wrote and the 2 short stories. And one of the interesting things is that it's very difficult to pin down the qualities of his Boer War poems. So when he finished what he called his war effusions, the 11 war poems for the forthcoming volume, the Poems of the Past and the Present, published in 1901, he proudly said, not a single one is a jingle or imperial. And then he anticipate the British public will consider that as a kind of defect. But then he say it's not imperial, it's not jingoistic. He doesn't really say what it is. And then in 1902, when he was interviewed by a French journal on the impact of the South African War on, English literature, he mentioned the large quantities of warlike and patriotic verse. And then he said these works naturally cast into shade works which are more philosophy and quiet. So most hardy scholars can sense that the tension between two categories of poetry. And then they consider that the adjectives Hardy used, quiet and philosophy, he's referring to his war poetry. So sometimes Hardy's war poems are considered as anti-war, but I think that doesn't really quite capture the sophistication of these lines, because it's not directly opposing war. And then Phillip have also mentioned this, home is one of the most frequently used words in Hardy's Boer War poems. So some scholars actually say that, well, there's no war happening in Hardy's Boer War poems. It doesn't really describe the customary trappings of war. It doesn't describe the enemies. And it's somehow missing. Hardy, in the first few departure poems, he's preoccupied with the scene of departure, and he writes about this thing from different perspectives, from different voices. And he's very preoccupied with the patterns, the structures of the war, which I think we can definitely explore a bit later.
So, Phillip, particularly your particular interest in the Boer War, I have to say that generally, I haven't thought, and I think a lot of people, maybe as ignorant as I am here, would have recalled the Boer War as a particularly important one, because, of course, it is so overshadowed by World War I, and also some of the iconic, shall we say, easily remembered things from the Crimean War. What is it about the Boer War and that poetry? Can you sort of perhaps give us a little taste of it? Because I confess I haven't read much that was written about the Boer War other than the historians' versions of it.
The war itself, as you say, is something that's easily overlooked. It's worth remembering that, as I mentioned, the scale of the war. This is the war that introduced the concentration camp. 100,000 or so South African women and children were rounded up by the British, put into camps nominally to protect them from black South Africans, in reality as hostages. They were let out when their husbands lay down their weaponry. It's a war of barbed wire. As a child, about the age of 10, I suppose, I remember seeing Catho News and seeing film of, I must have been the Russians in Hungary, and seeing barbed wire across the streets. And since I played in the streets, I knew that barbed wire in the streets was wrong. And so whenever I come across any reference to barbed wire, my instinctive, almost visceral feeling is there's something horrible about that. So this was a war that eventually did become truly horrible. A scorched earth policy, executions of prisoners of war, the shipping abroad to places as far afield as India of South African prisoners of war. The British captured, they had nowhere to put them, so they sent them off. So in many ways, it was a horrible war. But it was also a war that, for many of the people who stayed at home, was vivid, partly through the newspaper reports, partly because letters came back from South Africa more rapidly than they'd come from previous wars. But it was also a war where I think one can see in some ways little patterns of thought and feeling developing that we might still recognize. If I can, perhaps I can speak about Drummer Hodge. It's a 3-verse poem, and I've mentioned already the little head note that came with it. It's 3 verses, and curiously, I don't know what people will think about this, Hardy numbers them with Roman numerals. Now, it's not at all clear why you need to number a 3-verse poem. What the effect of that is, I don't know. It makes it look on the page almost like an epitaph or more monumental. They throw in Drummer Hodge to rest uncoffined, just as found. His landmark is a copy crest that breaks the belt around, and foreign constellations west each night above his mound. Young Hodge the drummer never knew, fresh from his Wessex home, the meaning of the broad karoo, the bush, the dusty loam, and why uprose to nightly view strange stars amid the gloam. Yet portion of that unknown plain will Hodge forever be. His homely northern breast and brain grow to some southern tree, and strange-eyed constellations reign his stars eternally. One of the things I would say about this, and it might be something that you've reflected on, Kate, in your own experience as a war correspondent, is the use of unfamiliar words which are now being integrated into English language. During the Falklands War, the word yomping came into use. I had never heard the word yomping before. Exclusion zones, green zones, IEDs. It's as if the public are trying to grow familiar with these terms. So when Hardy wrote in the manuscript, the velt and copy, he gives them capital letters as if to indicate they're foreign words. The printed text, they go into lowercase. So there's something slightly strange about the language of the poem. There are oddities in the poem which leave you unsettled. They throw in Drummer Hodge to rest uncoffined. Who is they? Is that the British troops who throw in Drummer Hodge because they haven't got time to bury everybody? Or is it that Drummer Hodge is left on the battlefield and the South Africans can't be bothered to give a formal burial? It's left uncertain. In a sense, it doesn't matter, of course, to poor Drummer Hodge. I think Hardy's almost incapable of writing a poem without putting in some verbal oddities. His homely northern breast and brain grow to some southern tree. Freud had just come across the idea of the uncanny, which he called the unheimlich, the unhomely. So here we have someone who is in one sense homely, who comes indeed from a plain, in a situation which is entirely unhomely, and a upas tree or something is growing from his body. Now that's a typical Hardy twist, a moment where words set sparks off each other that you didn't really expect. I've asked my students in the past how they take the last lines of the poem, and strange-eyed constellations reign his stars eternally. And they would normally say, well, this is a sign that the landscape is in some sense permanent. This is a war which is meaningless to Hodge, but in the great scale of things, the scale suggested by the stars, the war itself is meaningless. It's trivial. It's as unimportant in the grand scheme of things as Hodge is in the scheme of the South African War. But then I asked them what they meant by strange-eyed constellations. Is this the constellations looking down and thinking that's a strange thing going on down there? Is it the constellations are strange to the eyes of poor Hodge, who has never seen southern constellations, never seen the Southern Cross, never seen Canopus? Or is it that our whole situation is strange, that we are somehow adrift in the universe, that we in the universe don't get on, because there are the stars quietly rolling around, we are rolling around, traveling through space, and yet somehow we decide the right thing to do is to send 500,000 men to go off and kill 50,000 men. Now, I think all these things buzz around in the poem, and it's different from reporting, and it's different from simply approving or disapproving of a war. It's also the excitement of what language can do, and how language can set you firing off in all directions. And then you gradually, through all these little explosions of the language, find yourself circling back to a dead drummer in an empty landscape.
Is it different from what others were writing, literary people, about the war?
To my knowledge, yes. There were a very large number of poems which were familiar pro-war sorts of poems, the kind of play up and play the game sorts of poems. There were in abundance. There were some which were viciously jingoistic. Strike home England, says Swinburne in a poem that Hardy singled out for dislike, and smite these dogs agape with jaws of foam. That's a horrible, horrible image. And Hardy isn't writing like that at all. He's writing poems which take you back into your own imagination, your own understanding of what it's like to be human. Not just a soldier, a dead drummer, but anybody in the world who's trying to come to terms with these strangenesses, a copycrest, whatever that might be, strange stars that you don't recognize, a little Wessex boy turning into a southern tree. The world is a strange, weird and wonderful place. And Hardy is unable almost to write poems without reminding you of that. And I find that one of the things about the poems, which just makes them so exciting. They kind of buzz around in your mind. They set off fireworks.
Tai-Chun, your interest reaches back to the Crimean War. And Hardy, if I think about it, was just out of his childhood at that point. And you too are drawn to the Boer War. Have you anything particular of his about from your interest in the Crimean War?
Yes. So Hardy was rarely associated with Crimean War, I think. When you look at his letters, he doesn't really reference anything related to the Crimea. But what I find truly fascinating is two of his Boer Wars stories, Enter a Dragoon and A Changed Man. He wrote those two stories while he was working on most of his Boer War poems. And those two stories are based on the incidents and figures of the Crimean War. Okay, so I think in the handout, there's a quotation taken from Enter a Dragoon. And if I can just read out that quotation. So Selina, the daughter of the paddocks opposite, had been surprised that afternoon after receiving a letter from her once intended husband, then a corporal, but now a sergeant major of dragoons, whom she had hitherto supposed to be one of the slain in the Battle of Alma 2 or 3 years ago. So the Battle of Alma was the first major war won by the British and French allies in the Crimea. So one of the questions raised by Hardy's use of his materials, his allusions to the Crimea, is that why did he want to, draw on, the previous war when he was going through the current one? And I will suggest that, like many of his contemporaries, he was actually haunted by the traumatic memories of the Crimean campaign. And I'll give you just another example. Joseph Chamberlain, during the so-called Black Week, when the British troops, lost 3 battles in a row, and then the newspaper, coined the phrase Black Week. Joseph Chamberlain, when he was in giving a lecture, he told the crowd that, well, the Black Week just reminded him of the crisis during the Crimean War, and then he said he hoped the dawn will be found. Okay, so I find it fascinating that how there's a kind of curious correspondence between the past and the current conflicts, and how Hardy wrote about similar things in his prose and verse. And perhaps I can also refer to the very first war poem Hardy wrote. It's called Embarkation. And that poem also shows how Hardy made use of his personal experience of war and his treatment of the earlier and the current military conflicts. So it's on the first page of the handout. Okay, the poem was based on Hardy's witnessing of the departure of the troop at Southampton Docks on the 20th of October 1899. So famously, he cycled to Southampton Docks to watch the departure of the troops. And there's a distance of 50 miles. and he cycled both ways, and that's 100 miles. And in his letters, he mentioned it twice. I wish you could see with me, it's a magnificent sight. So there's a sense that he wanted to be part of the event. He wanted to be there. He wanted to witness, the ceremonies of the departure troops. But then when you look at the poem, which I'm going to read, you'll see that he didn't really translate his enthusiasm in the lines. He maintained a critical distance from his personal experience. Here, where Vespasian's legion struck the sands, and Surdy with his Saxons entered in, and Henry's army left afloat to win convincing triumphs over neighbor lands, vaster battalions pressed for further strength to argue in the self-same bloody mode, which this late age of thought and pact and code still fails to mend. Now deckward tramp the bands, yellow as autumn leaves, alive as spring, and as the host throws out upon the sea, beyond which lies the tragical to be. None dubious of the cause, none murmuring. Wives, sisters, parents wave white hands and smile, as if they knew not that they weep the while. Standing at the Southampton docks, the hardy speaker immediately think about the earlier conflicts, the earlier imperial conquerors and the troops led by them. So you have in the first line, the Roman emperor, and then in the second line, the Saxon king, and in the third line, Henry V. And it's interesting, his first poem begins not by describing the current campaign, by going back to describe the previous ones. And then this is published in a volume called The Poems of the Past and the Present. So in a way, his poem is about the past and the present. And then the line, to argue in the self-same bloody mode, it's really the repetition, the return of war, that this late age of thought and pact and code still fails to mend, that haunts, Hardy's speaker. And then it's like he's haunted by these phantom troops. And then, he had to slow down the motion of the current soldiers. And then the final couplet, he imagined the wife and sister and parents, they smile and weep simultaneously. But it's almost like the spectator knows better about what will happen. And it's already, he says, the tragical to be. But if the speaker knows something tragical is about to happen, it's because he has been informed by the previous wars about the calamities of war.
It's fascinating hearing, that obviously he put so much into the memory of those wars, but let us bring it on to World War I. And I'd like to ask you, Philip, that World War I, of course, to a huge number of people, you mentioned poets, and they will come up with many very familiar names. So there is Hardy alongside the Wilfred Owens and many others. Philip, just where does he stand with his World War I poetry?
He began writing poems about the First World War at public request. Masterman summoned 20-odd writers, including Hardy, Newbolt, Wells, Belloc, Galsworthy, a cluster of others, and said, write something patriotic. And Hardy, more or less the same day, given by the date of the poem, wrote Men Who March Away, which, as I've said, is a poem that at least one soldier, Victory Crowns the Just, thought was a dreadful, dreadful line. a number of the other poems have a self-consciously occasional ring about them. They're poems about recruiting money to help the destitute in Belgium and so on. Only a few, it seems to me, perhaps three, managed to escape the sense that they are poems written out of a sense of duty. Duty is not the best way to write poems. The last one of them, and the last poem in the volume before the volume, Moments of Vision, where these poems occur, ends with 3 or 4 poems which are about getting old, saying we are getting to the end of vision. And Hardy was now 77. And of course, every volume he published now he knew might be his last. So he got a little cluster of farewell poems. But before those come the poems of war and patriotism. And the last of those is a poem about the moon looking in through the window. And he's so startled what Hardy is writing, or what the speaker of the poem is writing, let us say. And he's so startled, he asks the moon, why are you looking at me? What are you doing? And the moon says, I'm looking for someone round about here who's just drowned himself because his son died in battle. But I'm also quite interested in what you're doing. Why is someone, I want to look into the blinkered mind of someone who wants to write in a world of such a kind. You know, what on earth are you doing writing poems at such a time? Now, that sense, I think, is something that hadn't really applied to previous war poetry. The sense that this was such an awful, endless, meaningless mass slaughter that was going to go on and on and on, that there was no point in saying something about it. Perhaps if I, again, I like having the words, the poems buzzing around. Let me quote a very short poem, 3-verse poem, that Hardy wrote and attached the date to 1915. It's called In Time of the Breaking of Nations. Only a man harrowing clods in a slow, silent walk with an old horse that stumbles and nods, half asleep as they stalk. Only thin smoke without flame from the heaps of couch grass, yet this will go on with the same, though dynasties pass. Yonder a maid in her white come whispering by, war's annals will fade into night, ere their story die. That's dated 1915. And a couple of things about it strike me. First, the allusion in Time of the Breaking of Nations. The biblical passage is extraordinarily eloquent. And if one tries to read the whole of that passage and see how it applies to the situation of the war, it's deeply ambiguous. In the passage, Jehovah is speaking to Babylon and is saying, I've used you to punish other nations, but you've gone too far and now I'm going to punish you. Whether that's a warning to the British or it's rebuke to the Germans is up in the air. Jehovah also says in that little poem, with you will I break the horse and the rider and the young man and the maid. So that little rather optimistic poem is actually contradicted by the biblical text. That's one thing. The other thing about it that seems to me very, very striking is the date 1915. I find it hard to imagine a poem opposing war or worrying about war, which begins as quietly as only a man harrowing clods. That's a tiny, tiny voice, a still small voice, Adie might have said, which you have to strain to listen to. But in 1915, perhaps that voice could still hope to be heard. I can't imagine that poem being written in 1917 during the Battle of the Somme. I certainly can't imagine someone writing only thin smoke without flame in 1945 after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By then, the notion of war had become so massive, destruction on such a scale.
I think we may have lost something there.
But to speak so quietly, there were poets who wondered whether or not there was any point in trying to write poetry any longer in a world that was so insane, which is in Slaughterhouse-Five.
Yes, he was a very great man of letters.
Yeah.
I mean, pretty well everything I imagine that he wrote was scrutinized, because here is this terrific name and a man, you know, whose reputation was enormous. Do you think, was he pushed in any direction by that? Did he get criticism?
I think he felt a sense of responsibility, and I think that was urged on him by the government and by fellow writers. And I say, I think most of the First World War poems are less successful than most of the South African poems.
Yeah.
But it is worth saying that a number of the First World War poets regarded him as a great hero. Siegfried Sassoon was among them. Edmund Blunden wrote a book about Hardy. T.E. Lawrence was a devoted friend of Hardy in this brief period in which he was at Clouds Hill while Hardy was at Max Gate. So although Hardy in some sense must have seemed to belong to a quite different world, to have no real experience of soldiering, and to have in a sense no business writing about what people like Sibley and Sassoon were experiencing, nonetheless they looked up to him and admired him, and took volumes of his poetry into the battlefield with them. Edward Thomas would be another. He did exactly that, took a copy of Thomas Hardy's poems with him to the battlefield.
Yeah. I'd like to ask both of you, Tai-Chun first, has his war poetry stood the test of time? It's a cruel question about poetry, perhaps, but it has to be asked when these are great events, which are, you know, people, particularly World War I, people still know a fair bit about. So where does the poetry stand the test of time? Tai-Chun.
I think it's fair to say his Boer War poems were one of the few that survived, and much of his contemporaries' war poetry have faded into obscurity. And immediately after, you know, the Boer War, some of his poems were gradually anthologized. And so I think people's admiration for his war poetry have actually increased. And when he was writing about his Boer War poems, he was actually quite concerned about his minority voice. But now, you know, partly because we, you know, think about war poetry as anti-war poetry. So somehow, you know, his Boer War poems are also on the right side of the politics. But as I kind of briefly mentioned, that the quality of his Boer War poems are quite subtle, and partly because it's very ambiguous. There's just so much room for discussion and then for explorations.
And what about you, Philip? Does it stand the test of time for you?
Well, we're still talking about them, of course, so that must be, let's hope, and people let us hope are listening. So in some sense they must. As I said, Hardy is the poet who matters to me most. And that's not simply to do with his subject matter, though that, of course, is often part of it. It's to do with something in the language and a gift for language which survives. In a sense, it's not just that poetry has changed since the Great War. It's that war has changed. The world that people were writing about has changed. And so that you might have been able to say only a man harrowing clods in 1915, but to say that if, for example, you were in the firebombing of Dresden and you were an American prisoner of war and you're trying to think something, you couldn't say something like that. The world had become like Catch-22, or that sort of image of war is what we now have, an absurdity rather than something else. But Hardy's voice, it seems to me, will always survive. One of my favorite poems, much too long to quote here, is The Souls of the Slain. And it imagines that if the dead, the spirits of the dead were returning from South Africa, the first place they might land might be Portland Bill. And in the poem, the speaker of the poem overhears them. And the poem begins, "The thick lids of night close upon me, alone at the bill of the isle by the race. many caverned, bald, wrinkled of face, and with darkness and silence the spirit was on me to brood and be still. Now, to me, that's not the Ancient Mariner. I feel I've been grabbed by the coat and I simply have to listen. And there's something about those lines which draws me in. Many caverns, what a wonderfully echoing word. And I find myself thinking, no, this is a voice that I have to listen to, because it's attentive to all that goes on in our language, and thus to a great deal of what goes on in our experience. Our experience is visual and so on, as well as linguistic, but much of our experience comes to us through language, or we hold it in our minds through language. And Hardy has a genius with language. And you know, I would say that to my dying day.
Well, thank you. That I'd like to, I've got lots more questions, but I think this is a point where we will say, if people have questions, please come up to on the chat, the Q&A. And have we got any at the moment? Harriet.
Hello, I've got one here from Dr. Boris Janssen, who says, I'm struck by the slippiness of the term they in Drummer Hodge. So I think this is referring to what you were saying, Philip. And in the last line of embarkation, if we read quickly, we might assume we know who they is referring to. But when we pause, we find it's difficult to pin down. Do you see the slipperiness of the term they in Hardy's other poetry, or is it specific to his war poetry, is what he's asked?
Oh gosh, I would love to be able to say I can remember all the poems in which Hardy used the word they. I don't think I can do that. I think that kind of ambiguity is something that Hardy brings into a number of poems. And I think it's quite conscious. Perhaps if one looks at the poem, A Christmas Ghost Story, that originally begins, south of the line, inland from far Durban, there lies, be he or not your countryman, a fellow mortal. The papers didn't like that line, so Hardy revised the poem. South of the line, inland from far Durban, there lies, a mouldering soldier lies, your countryman. Now, in both cases, the mouldering soldier goes on to ask about the meaning of the war and argues that the war is futile or it makes no sense to him. Now, Hardy apparently makes a concession by suggesting that he's going to be patriotic now, and the soldier we're going to listen to is our countryman. But if the person we send out to war, the person who is our countryman, doesn't know what he's there for, then our responsibility becomes all the greater. So I think when Hardy leaves the word they ambiguous, one of the things he's suggesting is that whichever meaning you give to it, it brings a kind of discredit to us. Either we left a dead soldier on the battlefield, took him from his home and just left him where he died, or we threw him in. In either case, something discreditable has happened. And I think the ambiguity of the word they just allows us, as you say, as the question says, if you read it quickly, you don't think about it. The word uncoffined is looming ahead of you, and that's the word that catches your attention. But the moment you pause on it, it's there. And the lines from Embarkation, the thing that strikes me, wives, sisters, parents wave white hands and smile as if they knew not that they weep the while. The tense changes, or almost changes. It's not clear. He doesn't say as if they know not. It's if the speaker is already beginning to withdraw. So those wives, sisters, parents are the wives, sisters and parents who were there when Vespasian arrived, when Cedric arrived, when Henry V left. It goes all the way back in the past, just by that little change of tense. Had Hardy written as if they know not that they weep the while, it would have referred clearly and only to those who are currently present there, the ones he's looking at. But as soon as you say as if they knew not, the time scale just begins to slip slightly. And I hadn't realized that until Tai-Chun read the poems. I'm very grateful to him for reading it, because that strikes me as yet another little discovery of Hardy's poems.
I have another question, if I may, and that is, a lot of the First World War poets wrote from their experience of war, very much so, and they are well known. in Hardy's life, all of those years, a long-lived life, and when he was born and as a youngster, there were still people around who'd been in the Napoleonic Wars. Then he lives through war after war of the empire, and there would be people returning home. And then again, the Boer War and into the First World War. He must have known, surely, and met a great number of people who had been in active warfare. Do you think that influenced him, listening to people who maybe were friends?
He went to see the Chelsea pensioners and did that on several occasions. He visited the battle site of Waterloo. When he was touring in Italy with Emma, he left her behind so he could go to the Battle of Lodi, the site where Napoleon first made his name as a military commander in 1795, I think. So he did keep up. Sadly, there's a story. Someone if people listening to this are local, they may be able to tell me more about this. A lady whose name I have now forgotten was known as the heroine of Waterloo because her husband from Fordington was a soldier in the war, and she went out with him. And she actually nursed people not after the battle, but actually by going onto the battlefield. And she was so much admired that she was buried at the expense of the army. She's buried, someone might remember, about 10 miles from Dorchester. She lived within 50 yards of where Hardy went to school. So she's the heroine of Waterloo. Her husband's a carpenter. Hardy's father, of course, is a builder. She's very, very local. And yet, to the best of my knowledge, Hardy never, ever came across her. Now, this just seems a terrible, terrible mistake by the universe, because if there was one person Hardy would have wanted to meet, it's a woman who actually nursed wounded soldiers on the battlefield of Waterloo, came back to Fordington with her husband and practically lived next door. But there's no record at all of him ever coming across her.
Tai-Chun, do you think that knowing people, having encountered people, because you're fascinated by the crime, several of the wars, which Hardy wouldn't have himself experienced, would have heard from others as he grew up. Does that strike you as important?
Yes, absolutely. So there's a wonderful phrase coined by another scholar called the private myth of war. And then that scholar used this phrase to explain, Hardy's understanding and perception of war. He said that he never participated in an actual fighting. He never saw war, but somehow he learned that through memories, memoirs, and also the fact that Dorchester was a garrison town. And of course, during the Boer War, one of the person Hardy corresponding with was Florence Henniker, and her husband was fighting in the Boer War. So there's a very curious relationship between Hardy and Henniker, because her husband was undertaking all these dangerous military operations, but then Hardy was writing about Walpole, sending her, his works and discussing them with her. And some of the works, describe the very unhappy mood of the soldier's wife. And then Hardy also showed a particular interest in, Mrs. Henniker's, knowledge of that battlefront.
The letters are very strange. One of his letters to Florence Henniker says, "I'm fascinated by war until I remember the human side of things. And given that her husband had just gone off to war, I thought that he might have deleted that and rethought it." Something, again, I don't know, and again, people listening might know this. During the South African War, one of the Boer commandos, Gideon Scheepers, was captured by the British in part because he was too sick to escape. And he was sentenced to death and had to be hanged while sitting in a chair because he was too ill to stand. contemporary accounts say that the officer who read out the sentence of death trembled more than the man who was about to be executed. But the officer was Florence Henniker's husband. Now, one of the things I don't know is whether or not when he came back, he would talk about this. One of the things that one comes across often is people who have experience of war and refuse to talk about it. People who discover that their husbands, usually their husbands, of course, have been involved in battle, have seen terrible things, have had terrible things happen to them or around them, or even done terrible things. But their family know almost nothing about it because they can't bear to speak about it. So there must be something very, very strange if Arthur Henniker didn't say, I had to execute a man who was so weak we had to tie him in a chair first. But Hardy could write about these things, whereas the man who'd experienced them, as far as I know, never talked about them. That seems to me strange. But Hardy was gifted with a sublime lack of tact at times. When Rider Haggard's son died, Hardy wrote a letter saying, you're so lucky your son has died because it means he spared the misery of life, or words to that effect. Probably the most crass letter ever written. Yeah. But that lack of tact is also part of the obsessiveness that fuels a lot of Hardy's writing. I mean, he simply has to go where his imagination takes him. And I like obsessive writers. There are well-balanced and mature and calm writers who are multifaceted and take everything into account and come to nice balanced conclusions. I like the ones who are driven. I like the writers who can't stop, who say, I have to go there, I have to go there. Hardy was...
I'm just going to interrupt to say we've got 2 more questions, and I'm aware we have 3 minutes left in theory. So if I could quickly read out both questions, and then you can then measure the time to answer them both and give them a bit of airtime before we get cut off. But the first one is asking if Hardy's career suffered because of some of his anti-war poetry compared with his peers. And the second one is talking about the recent events that have happened with the Education Secretary being accused by the OCR board of cultural vandalism for removing the work of Thomas Hardy and replacing it with new poets as part of the drive to make it the English GCSE more diverse. And so the question there is, do you agree? And what do you think the impact will be on the future generations who are unlikely to have any exposure to Thomas Hardy when studying English literature at the ages of 14 to 16? It's got 2 quite interesting questions there with technically 2 minutes, and I'm sure we can go over a few minutes.
The first one, I don't think Hardy's career suffered, partly because he wrote The Dynasts, and The Dynasts became so popular it was put on in a stage version in the early days of the Great War. It was true that in The Dynasts the enemy is France, and now of course the ally was France, but nonetheless it was regarded as a patriotic piece, and it was greatly admired by undergraduates especially, so that the new generation. And of course he got the Order of Merit in 1910, which suggests...
And the next, do you think he should still be read today on the curriculum?
He will be. If he's not on the curriculum, only idiots would come up with the sort of argument that the Department of Culture comes up with. It is, or Department of Education, it is simply crass and foolish. And if I say what I really think, you will have to beat me out, because I have no words to express my contempt for those arguments.
Well, thank you. And back to Harriet.
Well, yes, I just want to say thank you so much to all of our panelists and to Kate for chairing this amazing discussion. And I think it's real testament to Hardy's poetry that so many of those poems are still resonating with people. And one thing I've noticed, particularly working with Hardy's war poetry, is the ways that the poems such as Drummer Hodge and The Man He Killed and various other ones that are actually referring to the Boer War, people immediately assume are part of the First World War because they still have that immediacy to us. They still seem relevant, and so we pull them from the kind of further distant conflicts into our kind of consideration of what is modern history. And so I think it's been really fascinating to hear all your different takes on it, and I've really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for you all joining in and joining us in here this evening. And thank you again, Kate, for chairing it all and bringing it all together.
It's been fascinating, Harriet. Thank you all, and thanks everybody else for tuning in.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
And just to say, as you may see in the chat, Phillip and Tai-Chun have kindly said that if anyone has any burning questions that they would like to follow up with them, that a chat session is incapable of covering, you can email them on their emails to follow up any particular points you'd like to. So yeah, sorry, again, thank you so much for all joining us this evening.